Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fine, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 4 of our story tonight. So we've learnt about the Shannon house and the history of the Shannon house, which is a haunted house, and basically people don't last there for longer than 6 months, because there is claimed to be a ghost of a woman called Darcy Shannon, who literally drives all the people who move into that house away. So let's continue with part 4 of our story tonight. I could not believe that no sooner had the for sale sign gone up outside the Shannon house that I assumed would be there for several months. It was replaced with a sold sign the following day, and my first thought was, who in their right mind would buy the Shannon house, especially after the Greenbergs had fled the property in the middle of the night? Yet against all the odds, the Shannon house had been snapped up pretty quickly, and days later I knew someone had moved in, for I had seen a delivery van parked in the driveway of the Shannon house, and was curious as to who this family could possibly be that had bought the place. But when I inquisitively stared out of the window to observe the comings and goings of the removal men carrying furniture into the house covered in bubble wrap, I saw no signs of the new owners. I wondered privately if Pamela Freeman had actually told the new owners about the Greenbergs and how they'd all but run away in the middle of the night, as so incredibly haunted had they become over the house. Little did I know that I would soon meet the new owners of the Shannon house, sooner than I would have ever anticipated. It was a while later, while I was at my sewing machine, designing a brand new doggy coat, I heard a knock at the door. I wondered who could possibly be at my front door. I had made a few friends in the local area, so I thought that someone was dropping around for a cup of coffee and a quick chat. But when I opened my front door, who should be standing there but my mother? Now this was an impromptu visit that I was certainly not expecting. My parents were supposed to be visiting me later in the year. My mother was elegantly attired in a large floppy sun hat, with a scarf draped around the middle. She was wearing dark glasses and an elegant navy blue shirt dress with a pair of matching sandals. But what drew my attention to my mother the most was the broad grin on her face. I don't think I'd ever seen her look so happy. She looked like someone who'd just received a huge lottery win. "Mum! Surprise! Surprise! Look who it is!" chuckled my mother. "I bet you didn't expect me to be at your front door, Miranda dear. Why, I do believe you've gone absolutely white. All the colour is drained away from your face. Are you shocked to see me here?" "Mum! Of course I'm shocked. You never told me you were coming to this part of the world. I would have appreciated some advance notice. What are you doing here?" "What kind of a welcome is that, Miranda dear?" said my mother. "Honestly, I'd have thought you'd be a little bit more pleased to see me." "Of course I'm pleased to see you, Mum," I lied. "But why didn't you inform me you were coming? I mean, this is all a little unexpected, isn't it? I haven't even prepared a spare room for any guests. Where is Dad? Don't tell me you came alone." "Your father is back at the house, and he's doing fine, thank you very much," said my mother nonchalantly. "If you must know, he's unpacking some of the boxes. Goodness gracious me, I've had quite the morning, let me tell you, rushing around the place like a chicken without a head. But I'm a little bit more composed now that I've got the removal men to finally put the furniture in the right rooms. Goodness gracious me, they were driving me completely insane, putting the furniture down in all the wrong places. Honestly, you'd think they'd know better. I was really affronted when they put the lounge settee in the kitchen of all places. I had to tell them that a settee doesn't belong in the kitchen." "What removal men?" I asked my mother, looking perturbed. "What are you talking about?" "You mean to tell me, Miranda, that you didn't notice all the activity going on outside your front door? You do surprise me. I thought you'd have been a bit more observant than that. So I take it you haven't heard the really marvellous news, then?" "No, I haven't heard the news. What news are you talking about, Mum? Please enlighten me." "Well, me and your father have moved to the neighbourhood. I've just brought the Shannon house over the road from you. We're direct neighbours now." My face dropped. The watery smile vanished from my face, and I said, "You what? Is this some kind of a joke, Mum? Because if it is, I'm not laughing." "This isn't a joke, love. Why on earth would I pull your leg over something like this? I would have thought my being here at your front door would spell it out all too plainly for you. Me and your father have bought the Shannon house. The place went for an absolute steal. What a treasure the house is! So much fabulously flamboyant history attached to the place. I just couldn't resist buying it. And let's just say the wood groves at the back of the property go back for many miles, joining some fabulously well-established local hiking trails, so I'm told by the estate agent. I can see why you love it here so much. The countryside is absolutely perfect, and the town is so picturesque, so vintage-looking. The air is so fresh, so crystal clear. I feel as if I've stepped back in time. I think me and your father are going to be so happy living here. And with you living on the opposite side of the road, well, it doesn't get better than that, does it?" "But why would you buy the Shannon house, Mum? Are you completely off your rocker?" I asked. "No, love, I'm perfectly sane, thank you very much. And I certainly don't appreciate your insinuations. Of course I'm not mad. Moving here, let me tell you, was a very wise, well-thought-out decision. It makes perfect sense as far as I'm concerned." "But why, Mum? I don't understand. I told you I needed my space and a fresh start." "Well, I was thinking much the same. I was liking the idea of plenty of space and a fresh start myself. I thought it would suit me and your father just fine. I mean, you did insist on moving away, didn't you, love? And me and your father miss you so terribly. We want to be involved in your life and see you as often as we possibly can. When I looked online for a property close to yours, I couldn't believe the serendipitous good fortune that a house, a historic house of all things, was directly opposite your home, and it was for sale. I phoned the estate agent, a woman called Pamela Freeman, at once, and put in an offer for the Shannon house," said my mother, waving her hands in the air very nonchalantly. "I hasten to say your father wasn't keen about us moving to your part of the world and purchasing the Shannon house. He said it was like we were stalking you, and he thought it was extremely inappropriate. But I knew you wouldn't see it like that, Miranda, would you, love? What's wrong with your parents living in close proximity to you? It's not like we're stealing your thunder or your independence. You have your new life and your beautiful home, but you have us any time you need us, only a hair's breadth away from you. And what could be more ideal than that?" "Mum, did the estate agent warn you about the Shannon house?" I asked her. For a moment my mother looked somewhat bemused. "Warn me about the Shannon house? What on earth are you talking about, love? You've lost me, I'm afraid." "Well, the Shannon house. It's haunted. It's got an unpleasant history. Why would you buy a place like that, Mum? You do know the previous owners, the Greenbergs, up and fled in the middle of the night. I saw them leave myself, Mum. They were affrighted, let me tell you." "Oh, yes, I do remember the estate agent, Pamela Freeman, talking to me about such things. Goodness gracious, she was so reluctant to sell the Shannon house to me. She kept saying, did I know what I was getting myself into? You know, honestly, you'd think she'd be glad to sell the place. Anyway, she kept going on about the high turnover of people who've purchased the Shannon house over the years and subsequently fled. That doesn't intimidate me at all. She enlightened us to the history of the house and what happened there all those years ago in the Victorian times. But it certainly doesn't impact us now, does it? On the contrary, the vibrant history just adds to the Shannon house's charm, rather than detract from it as far as I'm concerned." "Ma'am, the Shannon house is not charming. The place is so menacing. Have you seen the burgeoning vines all over the grey walls? How dark the house looks all the time. How sinister it appears. It's far from charming, Mum." "Oh, goodness gracious me. Listen to yourself, Miranda. Of course the place is absolutely charming. You're beginning to sound as scathing as your father, who never liked the property the moment he saw it. The house is steeped in a rich history, for goodness sake. Which is probably why many of the impressionable locals living around here naively seem to believe the place is haunted. Honestly, have you ever heard such poppycock in all your life? I suspect it's the unenviable product of living in a small town. People like to gossip, don't they? And they believe in these fanciful fairy tales. But I'm not going to entertain any of this fictitious nonsense, or give such thoughts any credence. Mum, there's nothing fanciful about these stories that concern the Shannon house. I promise you there's something seriously wrong with the place. Even when I first came to this town, I was reluctant to buy this house of mine, even though the price tag was irresistible, simply because it overlooked the house you've just bought. If you must know, the reason why I got this house that I now own, much cheaper than the normal asking price of a place like this, is because people just do not want to buy a house that overlooks a haunted house, do they? Well, more fool them, said my mother, with a contemptuous snort. Their loss is our gain. That's the way I see it. Honestly, some people do believe in all this hocus-pocus stuff and nonsense. I'm very glad I'm not caught up in this illusory world that doesn't even exist, for goodness sake. Mum, haven't you heard a single word I've just said? The Shannon house is seriously menacing. I can't believe you bought it, Mum. I'm really disappointed that you did. Believe it or not, I was actually wondering to myself, who would be insane enough to buy the property, only to discover that it's my mother that bought it. I didn't expect that in a million months of Sundays. My face grew much more solemn, and I said in a troubled, disquieted voice that betrayed my grievous concern, Mum, I'm not sure you and Dad are safe living there. I'm being serious. I'm very worried about the both of you. Oh, listen to yourself, Miranda. You do talk such nonsense. I would have credited you with a little bit more intelligence and common sense than that, as to believe an old wife's tale such as this. Honestly, Miranda, you do talk nonsense. You're sounding like some of the folk in town that are so superstitious. I would have credited you with a little bit more intelligence and common sense than that. I mean, I'd never have expected you to believe in an old wives' tale about the Shannon house being haunted, for goodness sake. I'd have expected you to realize that things like ghosts weren't real. You used to say that you didn't believe in stuff like that growing up. I can't understand what's come over you. I suspect it must be the influences of living in a small town. It's rubbing off on you, in the most unbecoming of ways, if you don't mind my saying. I hope living here isn't going to make you susceptible to believing in all this stuff. How does Dad feel about the house, Mum? I asked. You said he didn't like the look of the place. My mother pulled a contorted face and waved her long hand in the air in a fanning gesture. You know your father. Always disapproves of most of the choices I make in life. I'm pretty used to it now, if you must know. Well, he didn't want to move to the small town for a start, and was dead set against it. But you know me. I can be awfully persuasive when I want to be. Of course, my own mother, your Granny Violet, was absolutely furious with me for buying the house opposite yours, would you believe? Honestly, that woman loves to meddle in my life. She said she'd given you the money to buy your own place and not for me to stalk you like this. I mean, honestly, the very idea that I'm stalking you is insane. I mean, what's wrong with living close to your daughter, I ask you? Your father wouldn't let me sell the house back at home, so we have to let it out to tenants for about 3 months or so. He's absolutely enraged at me for buying the Shannon house. And like you, he seems to be spooked by the place. The moment we arrived here, he kept saying the house gave him the heebie-jeebies. I've never known him to be like that before. I guess that maybe some of the common folk stories that people have been spewing around here have in some way rubbed off on your father. Honestly, and as for that estate agent, well, honestly, she wouldn't stop going on about how she was concerned about us buying this place, and that there were rumours and, I don't know. I switched off, let me tell you. I'd never have thought your father would be manipulated into believing that ghosts could potentially be real. It seems, really,
that he might believe the house is haunted.
I don't think Dad's overreacting, Mum. He's being instinctive. He sensed there's something off about the place. And he's right. There's something wrong with the Shannon house. And I promise you, you'll find out about it soon enough. And then you'll be persuaded to fix your beliefs. I'm telling you, Mum, you won't last there long. Nobody ever does. But I'm sure Pamela Freeman told you as much.
Well, she did. But I can tell you I don't buy into any of that nonsense. Me and your father are going to be extremely happy here. I'm looking forward to settling down in this charming small town and living close to my beautiful daughter on the opposite side of the street. Think about it. It's going to be so much fun. I'll be able to pop over to your house any time I like, especially if I've run out of a bowl of sugar or something. It'll be like the old days, don't you think?
As you can imagine, I was devastated that my mother had moved to the small rural town and was now living directly opposite me in that monstrosity of a haunted house that she had unwittingly dragged my father to against his will. And I could see he was not remotely happy about living in the Shannon house, and I couldn't blame him for that. I wondered if he managed to get a wink of sleep at night, lying under that roof. I soon became a regular visitor to the Shannon house, having stepped over the threshold against my will. I hasten to say, the heavy Victorian interior of the home was inauspiciously bodeful. The house was disproportionately dark on the inside, as if the light had been all but compromised, and was made all the more formidable by the dark, oppressive wallpapers in the house, the heavy curtains and dark furnishings. My mother seemed to be in her element, and spent all her spare time decorating the property to make it sumptuously cosy. But I doubted she would reach her ambitious objectives, as how could you possibly make a silk purse out of a sow's ear? Much like my father, I also had the feeling that when I was in the house that something was watching me all the time. I regret to say my mother began paying me regular visits at my home, and was starting to get under my skin, and slowly but surely she began to repeat some of her age-old habits of the past, even though she wasn't exactly sharing a house with me. But her constant interference in my daily routines was really getting me down, as I saw my independence almost vaporizing, rather like the steam from a kettle. It had never crossed my mind that my mother might follow me to my new location, where I lived, but now that she was here, she had become like a thorn in my side. I realized pretty quickly that some dragons in life you simply can't escape, and my mother was clearly one of them. I had moved away from home, all but to get away from the shackles of my mother's stronghold over my life. But I suspect after I left home, she felt she'd lost control over me in some way, and the only way she could get some of that back was to buy a property close by to mine, and preferably opposite me, so she could keep a bird's-eye view over me, and have some measure of influence over my life, which is exactly what she wanted. It was absolutely awful to feel her breathing down my neck the whole time, but there wasn't exactly much I could do about it, apart from gritting my teeth. My mother had already rather deviously had a spare key made to my house, so she could let herself into my property at will, whenever she pleased. This behaviour was already beginning to rub me up the wrong way. It had been such a pleasure to come to this small, rural, rather quaint town and gain some distance from my mother, and some much-needed space. Now my mother was back in my life. Dare I say it, rather like an unfortunate infestation of termites that I couldn't keep at bay. Don't get me wrong, I loved my mother very much, but I knew her indomitable hold over me was not a healthy one. I had, however, one reassurance in my heart that brought me a small measure of comfort. I knew unequivocally my mother would not last long in the Shannon house. I was certain the angry ghost of Darcy Shannon would spit my mother out soon enough, and my mother would quickly run back home with her tail between her legs, wondering why she'd been mad enough to come to the small town in the first place, and once again I would regain my independence, and that was a promising thought. Of course my father apologized to me profusely, hanging his head in shame rather bashfully, because my mother had bought the Shannon house.
"I tried to stop her, love,"
he told me apologetically, knitting his bushy brows together, to form a deep furrow.
But your mother is so damned impulsive. You know what she's like. We're now living in the town's most haunted house, would you believe? And that in itself gives me the heebie-jeebies. But there's no stopping your mother when she gets her plans into action. And this is a rather unfortunate one, I have to say. Your mother thinks all the stories connected to this house, about it being haunted, I mean, are fabrications. But I'm not so sure about that.
Dad, you're intuitive. Your feelings are very real. Don't dismiss them out of hand because of what Mum told you. I'm telling you there's something wrong with the Shannon house. I keep telling Mum that, but she refuses to listen. Everyone leaves the Shannon house after about 6 months, and when they leave, they are usually in quite the state, let me tell you.
My father nodded soberly. The estate agent told us the stories connected to the Shannon house. But you know what your mother's like. She paid them no heed. The good news is if people leave the Shannon house after a short period of time, hopefully we'll be out of your hair, your mother and I, in 6 months' time or so. We can keep our fingers crossed about that.
Dad, don't blame yourself for coming to this small town. This is Mum's fault, not yours.
I told your mother in no uncertain terms that coming to this small town was practically stalking you. Even her mother Violet told her as much. But your mother was refusing to listen to our advice. There was no stopping her. She's bloody-minded and impulsive.
Don't tell me what I already know, Dad.
Well, anyway, what can you do? Your mother is your mother. They broke the mould when they made her.
My parents managed to live at the Shannon house without incident for about 2 months, until all hell broke loose in the house one night. I had retired to bed early that night, and I woke with quite the start when I heard this frantic banging coming from my front door. What the hell, I thought, wondering who could be trying to get my attention at this time of night. I hurriedly jumped out of bed, with a somewhat apprehensive reticence that was dappled with a profound sense of foreboding, for I knew that nobody comes knocking at your door this late at night unless something is very wrong. Please God, no, I thought. I quickly wrapped my lightweight dressing gown around myself, slipping my small feet into my slip-on slippers, and then I trudged down the staircase, with the residues of sleep making my vision somewhat blurry. My father's voice broke the foggy state of my mind when I heard him call out, "Miranda, I need your help. Something's not right with your mother." My father's words propelled me to the front door at the speed of a bullet. The first thought that came into my head was that my mother was ill, or had taken poorly. Had she had a heart attack, perhaps? But she was far too young for that, surely. I hurriedly opened the door, my fingers trembling on the chain, my heart thundering violently in my chest. My father was standing in the doorway, wearing a pair of blue and white pinstripe pyjamas. He hadn't even bothered to put on a dressing gown, and his feet were bare. I noticed his face was drained of all its colour, and judging by his alarmed, affrighted expression, I knew that something was terribly wrong. His words were staggered and filled with a great trepidation. I don't know what's wrong with your mother, love. I really don't know what's going on with her. I thought you could possibly speak to her, to calm her down, perhaps. But she's behaving very strangely. Something's not right with her." "Have you called the emergency services?" I asked my father. "Maybe she's had a stroke or a heart attack." My father shook his head solemnly. "It's not like that, Miranda. Your mother's not sick, nor has she had a heart attack. It's just, how can I put it? She's not acting like herself. It's like she's possessed." "What do you mean, possessed?" I asked. "Come and see for yourself, love," said my father. "It's hard to explain to you in words. You need to see it to believe it, I'm afraid." Me and my father hurried quickly back to the Shannon house, our breathing fast and furious. When I entered the house, my heart was still visibly doing somersaults in my chest, for I didn't know what I would find when I approached my mother. There she was in the living room, flapping around the place like a frantic pigeon, trying to find an open window. One look at her and I absolutely knew that this was not my mother that I was seeing. Her eyes were consumed with such darkness, they didn't even look like my mother's eyes. and that I found to be incredibly disquieting. My mother was flying around the house, charging from room to room like a deranged lunatic, hardly even noticing that I was there. It was like she was caught up in her own little illusory world. She kept mumbling under her breath, and it didn't even sound like she was talking English. What the hell was going on with her? My mother had gone back into the living room after me and my father had followed her from one room to another. She stood still for a moment and then hurriedly ran over to the curtains, yanking them back very hard. Then she stood staring out at the woods rather wistfully, that were cast under the shadow of a silvery moon. "Ma'am, it's me," I said, trying to distract her from her trance-like state. Now that she was standing still, hopefully she might notice me. "Dad called me over to the house to see if you were all right. He's worried about you, Mum. He was saying you're having a bit of a meltdown. Would you like to talk about it, perhaps? Maybe you could tell me what's the matter with you, why you appear to be so frantic." My mother turned around to look at me, but there was no recognition in her eyes. They had become like empty, lifeless sockets, filled with an inky black colour. But the most disturbing thing of all was that there was a manic grin on my mother's face. "Don't come near me," she hissed in a warning voice that was more like a growl, "or I'll kill you. Get away from me." And the voice that came out of her just was demonical. It sent shivers of dread down my spine. I'd never heard my mother talk like this before. It wasn't her. She wasn't in her body. Something else was in her body. I don't know what was going on with her, but it was terrifying to say the very least. "See," whispered my father, "it's like something's taken over your mother's body." "Mum, it's me, Miranda. What's going on? Are you all right?" I said, walking towards the curtains to approach her as gingerly as I could. "You don't sound like yourself, Mum. What's wrong with you?" My father stepped behind me. He reached out to touch my mother's hand. "Love, it's Miranda. You can talk to her if you like. Tell her what's troubling you. She can talk to you, can't she, Miranda? That's why she's here." "Yes, Mum, I'm here for you," I said, not knowing quite how to react to my mother's unorthodox behaviour, as the grin she was wearing on her face was becoming increasingly more manic. My mother jolted forward, pushed my father backwards, shoving him so hard that my dad lost his footing. He fell back for a moment, but managed to get back onto his feet with no harm done, I'm relieved to say. My mother grabbed a glass vase off the table, throwing it violently at my father. It missed him by a fraction, and roses were scattered all over the floor. Glass lay broken in jagged pieces on the ground. My mother grabbed a sharp piece of glass, and with a manic grin still on her face, began to slash one of her wrists. What the hell was she doing? This was unbelievable. "Mum, stop, will you? Stop, you're hurting yourself. You're cutting yourself. Mum, you've got to stop." Me and my father, without sparing a second thought for our own safety, instinctively rushed towards my mother, to grab her and hold her down, while my father tried to yank the piece of glass out of my mother's hands. There was blood pouring over everything, gushing out of one of my mother's incisions on her wrists. Crimson droplets of blood magnanimously spattered across my mother's white nightie, while my father was getting cut from his courageous attempts to remove the deadly weapon from my mother's hand. My father was bleeding all over his blue and white pinstripe pyjamas, but he didn't give up in his attempts to get the treacherous weapon out of my mother's hand. But she held on to it with a formidable vice-like grip that was almost superhuman. What the hell was going on in this house, I wondered? Why was my mother idiosyncratically behaving as if she was consumed with a manic schizophrenia and an overwhelming desire to slash her wrists? A strange language was coming out of my mother's mouth. I knew one of the Latin words albio, which means leave or die. I suddenly realized that my mother must be possessed by the deranged spirit of Darcy Shannon herself, the woman who'd slashed her wrists in the 1800s and had been found by the authorities dead in the house after she'd thrown her husband to his death. Was my mother acting out Darcy Shannon's last moments, like a horror scene from the 1800s being played out again in real time? Had my mother now become Darcy Shannon? It would certainly seem so. I realized with a dreadful horror that if Darcy's spirits had taken over my mother's body, that her life was now in serious jeopardy, for something else had control over her body, and she was powerless to fight against it. If my mother succeeded in slashing her wrists like Darcy Shannon had done, then she could potentially kill herself, and history would once again repeat itself in the Shannon house. And we couldn't allow that to happen to my mother. She had to be stopped from harming herself. With a brute strength, my mother managed to escape me and my father's firm grasp. We simply didn't have the strength to hold her down, for she had become unfathomably powerfully strong. Before we could stop her, she had pulled back the sliding door in the living room that led onto the wraparound porch, and she was running down the steps across the backyard, making a beeline into the woods, still holding the large piece of fiercely sharp glass in her hands, which I was in no doubt she was going to use on herself to finish the job of slashing her wrists. She was getting away from us to finish what she'd started, without the threat of us trying to stop her in any way. "Go after her, Miranda!" my father screamed. "She's going to cut herself. She's already attempted to slash one of her wrists. She must be stopped, or she'll die." I began to furiously run after my mother. My breathing became raspy. My heartbeat boomed like a pounding drum that refused to abate. I was clad in my impractical attire, wearing a skimpy pair of pyjamas and a pair of slippers that was constantly sliding off my feet very inconveniently. But I took no notice of such trivial impediments, or the very fact that my vision on this night was dreadfully impaired. But I wouldn't allow any of this to dull my progress. I was welcomed into the grove by a tangle of trees that stood together side by side in tight clusters, making the footpaths precariously narrow. Their tall, lofty silhouettes blocked out the moonlight, while the branches, like gnarled, ugly hands, lashed out at my skin, and thorny briars tore into my flesh. My feet kept falling out of my slippers, but I noticed none of this. My lumbering, ungainly efforts to give my mother chase were pretty useless, to say the least, but I knew she couldn't be making much progress in the woods, for the light was so dreadfully obscure. So I slowed down my pace significantly, trudging around in the darkness rather like a blind man. In the distance I thankfully saw a light. I ran towards it instinctively. There was a large clearing where the trees were scattered and more widespread, so thankfully the moonlight spilled out her pearly glaze over everything, so at long last I could see more clearly. Then I saw the figure of my mother, sitting under a tree, her legs crossed over each other, her focus intent on slashing her wrists, while she had a demented grin on her face. Her white nightgown was now splattered liberally with blood, as it began to trickle out from the open wounds. I let out a scream. "Mum, stop! You've got to stop! You're hurting yourself! Please give me the glass, Mum! Give it to me!" My mother looked up at me, but in her dark, vacuously empty eyes, I saw only two soulless voids. It was like my mother wasn't present in her own body. I was not seeing my mother, but something tenaciously evil. I knew something demonic had taken over her body. I stood there for a brief moment, watching in horror as the blood spurted from my mother's open gashes, where her white nightdress looked like something out of a macabre crime scene movie, for it was fast becoming crimson. All of a sudden I saw him. I have no idea who he was, or whereabouts he came from, but he was like an answer to my earnest prayers, the prayers I'd been screaming out inside my head, that I'd been unable to articulate or even voice. I knew at once what I was seeing. It was a strapping male Bigfoot. He was about 11 foot tall, with burly, robust proportions that were nothing short of impressive. I have never seen anything more imposing, or so impressive in my entire life. And when my mother saw him, she screamed and screamed, for she was gripped with terror. In those dark eyes that did not belong to my mother, I witnessed what I can only describe as a palpable fear. Whatever had possessed my mother clearly saw the Bigfoot as an obvious threat, rather like a demon when it's confronted with a splattering of holy water. My mother did not move, almost as if she was held captive under a powerful spell that she could not fight against. The glass dropped from her hand, falling onto the forest floor, and dark eyes were fixed on the Bigfoots, while my mother began to growl at the creature. But the fear never left her eyes for a single second. I was frozen to the spot, my jaw dropping to the ground, as I watched the Bigfoot ripping pieces of my mother's nightdress into long strips and tying them to her wounds to stop the flow of blood. I knew he was helping my mother, and that his sterling, valiant efforts were saving her life, The Bigfoot began to speak in an ancient language, the likes of such I've never heard before or since. His words were authoritative and demanding. My mother began to scream and scream when he spoke, as if the words he spoke were torturing the demon inside her.
Finatalikas, hatila tanki, shila sikwani, kila tan santo, katila kibosha, kila dolabani, kolo sikali kwansi.
The more the Bigfoot spoke, the more my mother began to scream and scream, as if she really was being tormented. Then all of a sudden, I watched as this big, dense black cloud came rising out of my mother's chest. The smoke began to twirl, circulate, and take shape, becoming a hugely grotesque, giant-sized demonical beast that took a solid form. It had red eyes and a reptilian kind of skin, with a humanoid head, along with 2 prominent horns. The Bigfoot continued to chant, Kakikwasi, Hamfakina, Hagilasi, Holatina. And then the dark entity just fled, disappearing into a wisp of black smoke into the ether, and everything became still, calm, and very serene. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My mother at this point was lying across the forest floor, not moving an inch. All was silent. It almost looked as if she was dead. The Bigfoot continued to chant, and then a small yellow orb of light popped out of my mother's chest, like an illuminated ping-pong ball. The light left my mother's body, and then it too took shape, and that was when I saw the ghostly figure of Darcy Shannon herself, whom I recognized immediately in the silvery grey dress she was wearing. But this time she looked to be in her right mind. The Bigfoot spoke to Darcy. Kintaki, hakasanato, basikala. She nodded, turned around to look at me, and smiled. I could swear I heard the words in my head. Thank you. Thank you for setting me free. And then finally, she was gone. My mother remained unflinching on the forest floor. Her face looked white and ghost-like. Her eyes seemed empty. The Bigfoot then looked up at me and said to me telepathically, Get her help. She'll be fine. And with that he glided away, before I even got the chance to thank the creature for saving my mother's life. All of a sudden my mother opened her eyes. She sat up with quite a start, and looked nonplussed to find herself in the woods in the middle of the night like this, for she had no memory of what she was doing there. What's going on, Miranda? Why on earth am I in the woods in the middle of the night of all things? Goodness gracious, look at my nightdress. I'm covered in blood. And what are these bandages on my wrist? Why is my nightdress so ripped up? Is this some absurd kind of dream? She asked me. Before I could answer my mother's question, my breathless father was at her side, as well as a team of paramedics that he had called. My mother was rushed to hospital on a stretcher. The doctors told me, had I not wrapped the bandages around my mother's wrists, she would have ultimately bled out and died. I felt guilty for taking the credit for something I never did, as everyone thought I was a hero, including my mother herself. Looking back at the bizarre event, I do think Darcy Shannon from the 1800s knew that she was probably possessed by a demon. Maybe she tried to slash her wrists to free herself from the demonic stronghold that had oppressed her life for so long. I think the demon that took occupancy in Darcy Shannon's body made her come across to doctors at the time as having a mental condition like schizophrenia, when in actual fact my belief is that Darcy Shannon was possessed by a demon, the same demon that had taken control of my mother's body. When I encountered the Bigfoot in the woods, he knew exactly how to help my mother. First he attended to her wounds, and then he pulled out the demonic entity, as if he was conducting an exorcism of sorts. And finally, after he'd removed the demonic entity, Darcy Shannon was set free, and was probably able to cross over to the light. Who knows, maybe she was looking for the right person to set her free from the possession that had crippled her life even in death, and now she'd found my mother, and my mother must have been the right vessel in which to finally achieve the peace for which she obviously craved. I'm glad to tell you this story ends better than I could have ever anticipated. My mother decided that living in a small town was not for her, I think finding herself in the woods soaked to the skin in her own blood had given her quite the scare. I was relieved I wouldn't have her breathing down my neck any more. But the best news of all is that the Shannon house changed. It was as if the menacing energy had been lifted off the place. New people called the Tennysons moved into the property. They painted the grey walls white. They transformed the entire house. It's been 10 years now, and the Tennysons still live happily in the Shannon house, and it is no longer an unpleasant eyesore for me to look upon. I do think the ghost of Darcy Shannon has long gone. The Shannon house has found its peace. I still live in my beautiful home, but I'm now married to my husband Paul. We have 2 delightful children, a girl and a boy, and my mother is no longer an albatross around my neck, but I do see her and my father from time to time. Suffice to say, after the paradoxical incident that occurred all those years ago, she has become a much nicer person. As for the Bigfoot, I've never seen him again, but I know he saved my mother's life that night, and for that I'm eternally grateful. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.